My first point is, in any country's arms policies or disarmament policies, they are linked to their perception of their security doctrines. In other words, a particular position on a specific weapon system is part and parcel of a larger package of concepts and positions, and therefore I think it is a mistake to look at one arms control agreement independently from the larger picture and perception, be that insecurities in the region, be that other arms control agreements, imbalances, and so on and so forth. I do not question the fact that you can't look at everything every time you try to deal with any issue. But that being said, you can't deal with a specific weapon system, in this case weapons of mass destruction, without looking at the overall security doctrine of the different states in the region, be they Arab, Iran, or Israel. The second point is that, and I agree with Hassan, there are obviously international responsibilities that we all have in taking security decisions and joining agreements or the lack of it. However, at the end of the day, the primary focus is on our theater of operations, or the theater in which we see our security being most prominent. For smaller countries, they tend to be sub-regional. Medium-sized countries, they will be regional, and global countries, they will be global. But in essence, to simply argue that a country should take a position because of the international obligations alone is nice, but frankly wishy-washy and won't get you very far. On the other hand, no one can act in isolation from the international norms and conditions. So, to cut it short, regional will always trump international if countries have to make a choice. The third point I want to make is, if one looks at the Middle East, there's no question that the Middle East is in flux. Whether it is for political reasons, social reasons, economic reasons, demographic reasons, and I can go on and on. And with that, one has to admit, yes, given that all of that is in flux, the permanency, or lack of it, of security doctrines comes into question. How will states in this region, how will that affect their security doctrines in the future? There will always be some continuity, but there will always be a degree of change. The fourth sub-point I want to make here is that, again, at the end of the day, it's a matter of time, but at the end of the day, in the security doctrines that states adopt, in the general context in which they're operating, whether it's a stable or unstable situation, at the end of the day, military balances and legal obligations that they have or that their neighbor have come into play, and because that's what defines the sense of security or the sense of insecurity. So none of these four factors should be ignored when we start looking at what's the driving force or what are the brakes in the process of trying to develop a zone free of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East with a priority on nuclear weapons. And it applies, frankly, to all of the different states in the region, be they Arab or non-Arab. The second point I'd like to make really is, frankly, since this conference this workshop wants to focus most, or wanted initially to focus most on the security in the Gulf, I think it's important to look candidly at the sense of security or insecurity in the Gulf. I come from an Arab state, but I'm not from the Arab Gulf states, so I speak carefully, but this is my perception of what they're feeling. I have no doubt in my mind that given the state of play in terms of the Arab Gulf security systems, there will continue to be a strong foreign component in the security systems for a long time to come. That component is simply too significant to change rapidly and in a fundamental fashion. I also have no doubt in my mind that in light of the changing Middle Eastern paradigm generally, specifically in states that tended to play a leading role in the Middle East, in the Arab Middle East, like Egypt, which were very friendly to the Arab Gulf states. And over and above the issues mentioned yesterday, for example, the changes in technology that may create less of a dependence on Gulf energy, the lack of a Cold War mentality, generally speaking, changes in military technology that frankly put less of a focus on maritime technology than on other forms of technology, for all those reasons. And I would add to it, very candidly, another one, frankly, the changes that occurred in Egypt and how they occurred. Specifically, how far the U.S. supported or did not support President Mubarak during the revolution. Now again, I'm talking about perceptions rather than necessarily the reality, because I don't think that the Americans could have supported Mubarak more. But the perception is that they left him out in the cold. So for all of those reasons, my feeling is that the Arab Gulf states will, while continuing in much of what they're doing, they will continue to feel more concerned about change, probably feel more insecure, and consequently, while I don't know how far they will go, my sense is that they will be developing much clearer and concrete worst-case scenarios, especially that, as I just said, their traditional ballast in the Middle East, which was Egypt, is not focused at the time being, and it's not clear, frankly, where it will be vis-a-vis these countries in the short and medium term, although long term, I have no doubt in my mind that it will continue to play this role. Thirdly or fourthly, which would lead to concerns in the Gulf, yesterday we heard very interesting and passionate presentations by our Iranian colleagues about the Iranian nuclear program, explaining the justification behind that. And again, without questioning the motivation behind the program or not, there's no question that it raises a concern for the Arab Gulf states. It raises a concern because it brings in a new dimension, and it brings in arguments of grand designs and grand bargains that could include the Arab Gulf states, but could also not include the Arab Gulf states and be at their expense. Now, I haven't, at this point, even mentioned that Iran's nuclear program, in the eyes of the Arab Gulf states, needs to be taken into, put in perspective in light of Iran's political activities in Iraq and the Gulf. In other words, how you interpret the program is not in isolation from the political policies that exist. Now, I think there's an exaggeration on a lot of the accusations being addressed to Iran, but I also think there are things that Iran can address quite seriously to calm the Arab Gulf concerns. My conclusion, frankly, is to build on, conclusion on this point is that in the Arab Gulf, you'll see even more of what our Iranian colleagues mentioned yesterday. The Arab Gulf states have been very large procurers of conventional weapons. of sophisticated conventional weapons, and in the years to come, I expect for you to see even larger acquisitions of these kinds of weapons, and probably from different sources as well. So, whether or not we have a zone free of weapons of mass destruction, you're going to see a skyrocketing arms race in the Gulf, and that is not going to be helpful to the creation of a zone, but it's a factor that we have to take into account, especially if we remain inactive in trying to deal with these security concerns. The third point I want to make is, well, okay, what can the international community do to respond to the concern about nuclear proliferation in the Middle East, particularly the idea of creating a zone? First of all, and I say this with a sense of frustration, the overwhelming majority of the arguments I've heard about concerns on non-proliferation in the Middle East are concerns about the consequences of proliferation in the Middle East on the security of the industrialized world rather than the Middle East. In other words, it's about threats to security outside the region rather than threats to security in the region, irrespective of whether the threat is coming from Israel, from the Arab world, or from Iran. It's mostly about, is that a threat to the world rather than a threat to each other? And frankly, that's one of the reasons, not the only reason, but that's one of the reasons why we're not moving forward. Secondly, in responding to the concerns in the Middle East, and beyond that, to be fair, I think the international community is moving away from the respect of its own international norms. You're all going to expect me to say, and I will say it, I think there's a double standard in how we're dealing with the Israeli posture. Not because Israel doesn't have the right to decide whether or not to join the NPT. It does have that right. But at the same time, if you're asking states that have joined the NPT to take additional measures because the norm for non-proliferation is the NPT and therefore they need to be faithful to that, then I think if you're going to accept that as the norm, you need to do a lot more in terms of trying to energize towards universal adherence of Middle Eastern states to the NPT. And I would argue, frankly, that the position taken vis-a-vis both India and Pakistan, while justifiable and understandable from India and Pakistan's point of view, are completely inconsistent with respect to the members of the NPT states, particularly the suppliers group. If you're going to pick and choose when to apply a principle and a norm, then obviously it's going to be determined by your politics and your interests. And therefore, even though I found Mustafa's comments yesterday very passionate, therefore you will hear points like what Mustafa said yesterday. I can't trust a system that doesn't put my interest at the head of the priority, and that does not stand on principle. You're standing on politics when the principles serve your politics, rather than the other way around. So if you really want to help promote, whether it's a zone in the Middle East or deal with non-proliferation in the Middle East, you need to continue to be true to the international norms that we've all agreed to, with all of their weaknesses. Adherence to them is better than having weak regimes which we don't adhere to or we do not respect. It would, of course, be better if we respected them and enhanced the regimes, but that's a different debate. The additional point I want to make under the role of the international community is, frankly, put your money where your mouth is. You're holding Middle Eastern states accountable for their respect or lack of respect for non-proliferation agreements, and you should hold them responsible for that, accountable for that. There's no justification for anybody not to be compliant under any circumstances. And if we're going to accept international norms, then we should act in the spirit of transparency that leads to confidence, not try to push agreements to the limits of where we can get away with things without declaring, but actually try to take advantage of the agreements to verify and explain our motivation. But again, if you're going to do that, then frankly you have to apply the same medicine to yourselves. The majority of the technology that has been proliferated over the years has come from Western industries. And you have not held yourselves accountable for that. Be they directly, all of the nuclear programs in the Middle East started off in the West. And even the networks that were caught recently ultimately have foundations in the West. And the investigations on those seem to die away very calmly and very quietly. Now, if you're going to ask for an extra standard here, and frankly we need it because we live in a Middle East that is in turmoil, and it's going to have to apply throughout. The last point I want to make on this point is, and I think it was, anyway, somebody said this yesterday, Middle East is unique because there are so many players playing in it from outside the region, over and above the different historical baggage that exists between the regional states. Well, the security doctrines in the region are going to change, but the security doctrines outside the region to the region are changing. And I actually think that repeating theories that apply to Cold War scenarios and assuming that they're going to continue, I'm not convinced. And I much prefer that we have candid, open discussions with our friends whom we have a security relationship with to really understand how much they will continue and why to do what they're doing and how much of a burden we need to continue. Because that helps us also, we continue to do that, also helps us also balance out our relations with our neighbors, which is the primary thing. My fourth point is how this affects the NPT. I think it's unquestionable that positive progress on trying to create a zone free of nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. And that, by the way, is the language used to define the 1995 resolution, 2010 resolution. It does not say weapons of mass destruction. It says nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. The priority is on nuclear weapons, specifically because the NPT deals with nuclear proliferation.
And delivery vehicles.
Exactly. So that's where it starts. Now, any progress we achieve on that will, I believe, be a point of strength and consolidation for the NPT, a reflection that not only the letter but the spirit of the NPT is being enhanced. And I would argue that having had the original zone proposal since 1974, and then, as Dr. Karim was saying, the 95 resolution, and then 2010, the lack of progress will be detrimental to the NPT, not because the Arabs go or don't go to a prep committee. The reason that the Israelis gave for not joining NPT, which is legitimate, don't agree with them, but it's a legitimate reason. They said it does not satisfy our security concerns. Now, I think they're wrong, but that is a rational reason, irrespective that I don't agree with it. Well, the reason the Arabs joined was because it enhanced their security concerns. If it continues not to, then if you don't expect them to ask themselves, what do we do? You're being very naive. I'm not suggesting that it necessarily will mean they're going to withdraw from the NPT. And again, I started off by saying the security doctrines are interrelated. So what happens on the NPT may lead to steps that I take vis-a-vis the NPT, but they also may lead to steps that I take on 10 other things, in and outside the NPT. So rather than focusing on a prep committee, there are two things happen that we need to deal with carefully here. One, the NPT members themselves, irrespective of what Israel agrees or does not agree to, said that they, in 1995, would take concrete steps towards the creation of a zone for nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. It has nothing to do with Israel in terms of the decision itself. So we are obliged, as NPT members, to find ways to move this process forward. the 2010 conference was one of the suggested steps that was taken. It was not the only step, by the way, that can be taken, but it was one of the suggested steps. If Israel doesn't want to come and we don't have a conference, we are still bound by, I mean, our contractual agreement is not with Israel, it's with the other NPT members. And we're all still bound by trying to find ways to take measures to move forward towards the zone. And you need to look at that, because simply saying, well, the Israelis don't want to come, therefore that's all we could do, I'm sorry, that's not going to fulfill the obligations that you have. Now, you mentioned, Paul, something like the FMCT, and I can give you a series of other suggestions. Well, you're going to have to look at these things. How are you going to move this thing forward? And the second part of it, frankly, is do we accept that even though as NPT members we agreed to try to convene this conference, if a non-NPT member decides that no, it doesn't want to participate, what's the implication of that on the efficacy of the NPT as an international norm? And how is the NPT here responding to the interests of the Arab world, and in this case also Iran from outside the Arab world? And therefore, the implications of the lack of security here. Now, again, it's not about, and I've been to several meetings, and there's seems to be this obsession with, will the Arabs come to the prep committee? Frankly, if I was you, I'd prefer that they don't come. Because if they come, you're going to really hear a lot of interesting comments and strong statements. And I completely agree with them. Now, in terms of my conclusions, having made those comments, if we're going to move forward towards trying to create a zone free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East, we are going to have to deal with the security needs of the Arab world, Israel and Iran, not their aspirations. There is no way one can come and say, I'm not going to deal with the needs of Iran, Israel, or the Arab world, but we're not bound to deal with their aspirations. And that's the kind of dialogue we're supposed to be looking for. What are the needs? And I've even here jumped over the rights. There's a difference between the rights which they can pursue nationally and the needs where I have to be able to work with to help them get to. But I don't have to respond to aspirations. So there's going to have to be a cooperative approach from different states in looking at the other side, but at the same time, a realistic approach by states not to try to push their aspirations at the expense of real needs and the interests of others. The other point is you're going to see a greater regionalization of security doctrines than in the past. And I say this whether in terms of the change in relationship with international players or in terms of I think that, for example, the Arab Gulf states will, in a few years, come back again and depend more on the Arab world than they are doing now for their security, but they'll also depend more on themselves. And that's going to lead to a larger focus on regional developments than we have now, which tends to look at international security paradigms in the middle of this. But I would argue also that as that happens, you will see a shift in both the Iranian doctrine and the Israeli doctrine is different. But anyway, the last point I want to make really is, I think it was Hassan, if I'm not mistaken, but also probably Mahmoud, because of how complicated the Middle East is, because of our own weaknesses and problems, but also because there are so many foreign players playing in the region, we will not be able to resolve this issue without international help. The idea is that put the Middle Easterners together, and they will sit down and get a zone or solve the proliferation issues. It's not going to happen. If you look at what is being asked of the Arab world, what's being asked of Iran, what's being asked of Israel, there's always at the end of that sentence a foreign component in there. And therefore, all of these states, all of these groups will factor in the foreign dimension, the international dimension, as they define their security concerns. In that light, frankly, we're not going to be able to work completely independently. So there will have to be an international contribution to this process. And I would close by saying, as risky as the Middle East may be, and as much change as we're seeing, I still believe that, well, let me make 2 points. One, the process of creating a zone free of weapons of mass destruction will take time. So this is not going to require immediate decisions in the immediate short term. Although, if you take what we've said, what we've all said, to be truthful, we've actually all made the commitment already, that we all supported the zone. But again, this process is going to take time. That's my first point. The second point really is, whatever the circumstances that come out of the Middle East over the next 5 years, be they a modern Middle East of a democratic, peaceful system, or a tumultuous Middle East where it's unstable, having weapons of mass destruction in it doesn't help. So either way, it is to the benefit of everyone to work on a process that leads us to a region that is free of these weapons. Thank you.